We've left untouched the biggest segregation of all that overwhelms everything else and hangs over our entire society, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. There are clearly defined areas in every one that I've lived in that are all white or mostly white, or all African American and mostly African American. And all of us accept this as part of the natural environment. It's not we think it's a good thing. We know we say it's too bad, but we think it's sort of natural, normal, something we accept. It's not that we've tried to do anything about it and have failed. We've never even tried. And so in order to rationalize to ourselves our failure to undo it, we've adopted the national myth. And that myth is pervasive. It's pervasive across the political spectrum. The liberals and conservatives hold it. The blacks and whites hold it. The name of that myth is we have de facto segregation. Not something that was created by government like all the other segregations that we undid in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but this is something that sort of just happened by accident. It happened because people like to live with each other of the same race. Or it happened because private actors, whether they were real estate agents or bankers or private citizens, discriminated in how they sold or rented homes. Or it happened because African Americans happen to be poorer than whites on average, and therefore they can't afford to move to middle-class communities. De facto segregation is an utter myth. There is no basis to it whatsoever. The racial segregation in every metropolitan area in this country was created by racially explicit government policy designed to create racial boundaries, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another, with policies that are so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape that we see in cities all over the country. Just like we have the myth of de facto segregation, we also think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live, where lots of mothers with children, single parents with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, acting out, engaging in oppositional behavior that attracts attention to the police and a cycle of violence that we've seen in so many places. That's what we think of as public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for middle-class, working-class families. During the Depression, poor people were not permitted into public housing when public housing was first created. There was a housing shortage, and public housing was created for people who could afford to pay the full rent in housing, and they did in public housing, but for whom there was no housing available. Everywhere, the Public Works Administration and the other federal agencies that succeeded it created segregated public housing, separate projects for African Americans and whites in cities all across the country, frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated, that were integrated. During World War II, the actions of the government intensified to create segregation. They intensified because throughout the country, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production, of war production, to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. And the migration of workers into centers of defense production overwhelmed frequently the communities where they were working. The federal government had to build housing for these workers if it wanted the ships to be produced. For the African Americans, they built the housing on temporary housing because the explicit goal of the housing was that African Americans after World War II would leave and go back to the South. So they built temporary housing for the African Americans along the railroad tracks and near the shipyards, and they built more stable housing for the white migrants in the white residential areas. Very soon after that, in the mid-1950s, a development occurred everywhere in the country, which was systematic, similar, and widespread. And that was that suddenly, all the white projects began to develop large numbers of vacancies. All the black projects began to develop long waiting lists. And soon the situation became so untenable, so conspicuous. You couldn't have projects in the same city, some of which were virtually empty, and the other of which had long waiting lists. The federal government and local housing agencies opened up all projects to African Americans, and then at about the same time, industry left the cities. Fewer and fewer jobs became available to the now increasingly and soon almost all African American population in the public housing. The population could no longer afford to pay the full cost of its rent, so the government had to begin subsidizing public housing. Maintenance declined in the projects. Prior to this, maintenance workers lived in the projects. They were paid good salaries and lived in the projects. Upkeep declined. The projects became vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing today. Another federal program that was perhaps even more powerful in creating racial segregation, and that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration designed to move white families out of urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. On a racially explicit basis, we created a white noose around every urban area with federally subsidized single-family home subdivisions. These were giant subdivisions in many cases. The most famous of them, I'm sure you've heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to build 17,000 homes or 15,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers? We were in a suburban country at that time. People thought the whole idea was lunacy. Who's going to want to live in a single-family home when they can live in the city instead? Any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not that they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families over the next couple of generations gained, you can do the arithmetic, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity. They used that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation, and of course it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
One of the main reasons was because it was a white community.
And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here.
This was Levittown, Pennsylvania, shortly after World War II, in a suburb that explicitly promised a white-only neighborhood. And it wasn't some outlier. It was the prototypical suburb, built by the father of suburbia, Bill Levitt, who created several suburbs around the US, all named Levittown. But one reason Levitt wanted a white-only community was because the US government was subsidizing it, and that's what they wanted. They said they didn't want racially inharmonious groups, lowering property values. That's why Levitt didn't just sell cookie-cutter houses. He sold a meticulously crafted, affordable, utopian lifestyle. So as the courts integrated public spaces like schools, more and more white people fled to these suburbs. And these patterns are still the defining characteristic of America's racial geography. But we now spend most of our time at work, and there, it gets a lot more complicated.
More than 1 million persons each year have pulled up stakes in the cities and turned commuters.
Shortly after the first Levittown broke ground in 1947 in Long Island, New York, about 80% of men still commuted the hour to Manhattan. And while neighborhoods were getting deeply segregated, these workplaces were getting more diverse. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned employment discrimination. More companies explicitly said that they were equal opportunity employers. And segregation within our workplaces declined. This meant the workplace was a crucial environment for us to interact with people of other races. Except that's not exactly how it turned out. A few months ago, researchers at Cornell and Penn State shared a dataset with me, and when I mapped it, it kind of blew my mind. This is a map of where people work in modern-day Chicago. The taller an area, the more people there are. But now let's color in each neighborhood by the percentage of white people. You can see the city centers are pretty diverse. But now, here's what happens when they go home. What's even more astounding is what happens when we map people of color. Here's where black people work in Chicago. Again, they're concentrated in diverse city centers. But when black workers go home, they go to very segregated neighborhoods, clustered in poorer areas. And we can see the same patterns in DC, Detroit, Philadelphia, pretty much everywhere in the US. These maps show just how stubborn residential segregation is. But they also show what looks like a glimmer of hope for integration. Cities are remarkably diverse during the workday. So this got researchers interested in looking closer at what's at work. Let's look at how segregation changed in recent years. From 2000 to 2010, residential segregation between black and white people got slightly better. For the most part, segregation just mostly plateaued for all racial groups. But when researchers looked at how segregation changed during the day when we're at work, they found that segregation increased slightly across all racial groups. When we zoom in some more to the company level, we can see a bit more of what's actually happening. Researchers at Stanford and Harvard found within a company, segregation levels have gone down very little. In other words, we're exposed to about as much diversity now as we were a generation ago. But there are a lot more people of color now than there were in 1980. So what's going on? Well, they aren't being more represented at these white majority companies, which would look like this. Rather, they're getting opportunities at companies that are mostly non-white, over here. So this means that when we look at this from a company level, segregation has actually gotten worse than a generation ago. Of course, some places are pretty diverse. So researchers looked at what kinds of places actually have less segregation during the day. But they found that if a place is diverse during the day, it's likely not because people of all races are working alongside each other. Rather, it's probably because most of the higher status workers, like managers, are white, and the lower status workers, like janitors, are people of color. American policies engineered our segregated homes. But work, where we spend most of our time, many thought that could be a space where we form meaningful relationships with people of other racial backgrounds. That hasn't quite happened, and we see it in the most personal parts of our lives. In 2014, the Public Religion Research Institute asked Americans to list the people with whom they've discussed important matters in the past 6 months. In other words, our friends. Most Hispanic people had friends of other races. About 1 in 3 black people did too. But 75% of white people only had white friends. In short, we may be exposed to diverse spaces, but we still live very segregated lives.
But the whole trouble with this integration business is that in the end, it probably will end up with mixing socially. And you'll...
Racial segregation in the US is not in our past. It's our present. There's a crazy wealth gap between white and black Americans that's tied to home ownership. White Americans hold 7 times the wealth of black Americans, the same ratio as in the civil rights era. And even though black people make up nearly 13% of the US population, they hold less than 3% of the nation's wealth. Now you have to understand that owning property is the major way American families build wealth. But when state-mandated discrimination stops black people from owning their homes, the growth of their wealth gets halted too. Okay, you have to go way back to see how this happened. When the Great Depression hit, the federal government created public housing to help American families for the first time. They mostly made public housing projects for white people, but there were some made for black folks too. By the mid-1930s, the government was offering subsidized mortgages at a fraction of the price for white families, so they could move into brand new houses in the suburbs. Black people were specifically prohibited from these deals. They instead had to stay in public housing, often paying more for their rent than white families paid in mortgage. On top of that, the practice of redlining grew across the nation. The HOLC created city maps to indicate the level of risk for real estate investments. These maps ranked desirable neighborhoods for lending, such as white suburbs, in green, and marked undesirable or risky neighborhoods often populated by black communities in red. As a result, redlining destroyed the possibility of investment wherever black people live, ruining their chances at growing their wealth, property, or social mobility. Meanwhile, the government bagged $120 billion in low-cost home loans between 1934 and 1962. More than 98% of these loans went to white homebuyers. By the time housing segregation was banned in the Fair Housing Act of 1968, it was too little, too late. The damage was already done for generations. The inequity of home ownership had launched a domino effect that made it far too difficult for black families to try and purchase homes in similar suburbs. These neighborhoods had quadrupled in value over time, leaving black Americans far behind. Today, 73% of white households are homeowners, while the percentage for black households is only 45%. Even worse, black people who reached homeownership sometimes faced violence as a result, at the hands of white Americans and police. Racially segregated neighborhoods have a grave impact on many realms of American life. Where you live can determine what kind of education is available for your children, how much wealth you can have, your relationship with law enforcement, and even your own family's health. The biggest takeaway from all of this? Racial segregation and the wealth gap in the US is not just due to personal prejudice or private actions. Instead, it's a direct result of state-sanctioned policies intended to stop black Americans from achieving success that in many ways continues today.
In theory, we ended school segregation 62 years ago, but in reality, things are still pretty bad today. You might be thinking, what the hell are you talking about? In Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court decided that we can't racially segregate our schools anymore. Well, that worked for a while. We definitely saw improved integration through at least the late 1980s. But today, American schools are more segregated than they were over 4 decades ago. No, seriously, that's a true story. In 2011, for example, more than 40% of black students attended schools that were 90% people of color or more. That's up 5% from 1991, which means we're going backwards. So what's going on here?
We are definitely reversing a lot of the progress that was made certainly in the late 50s and throughout the 60s.
Back in the day, there were all these court orders that required schools, by law, to desegregate. This was a way to combat all the massive resistance to the Brown v. Board decision. Now you might be thinking, Nano, stop being so dramatic. Get out of here with all this massive resistance talk. No, massive resistance was literally the name of a policy adopted by Virginia's state government in 1956 to block desegregation efforts in public schools. But now those court orders have expired, which means school districts don't have to do the work required to make their schools less segregated. And we can thank the Supreme Court for that. Starting in the 1990s, the Supreme Court passed a series of decisions that dissolved almost all of the desegregation plans that followed Brown v. Board. In some instances, schools wanted to keep their integration plans, such as busing, because they were working so well. But they weren't allowed to because the Supreme Court said that they were discriminatory against white students. By the way, this kind of segregation isn't just happening in states below the Mason-Dixon line. It's happening in, drumroll please, New York. The South is actually the least segregated region for black students. And Latinos in progressive, new age, quinoa-loving, gluten-free California are the most segregated students in the country. And the epicenter of this resegregation happens to be right here in LA. That's because the Supreme Court put more demanding court orders on southern states to desegregate their schools, but didn't do the same for northern and western states. I guess the Supreme Court just thought there was no racism in the North and the West. And another major reason why our schools are still largely segregated is our neighborhoods are still largely segregated by race and income.
Well, housing inequality is very much tied into educational inequality. I think some people would go as far as to say that it is really impossible to understand educational inequality without understanding the underlying housing inequality of our society.
See, there's this thing called school assignment. It basically means that school districts have to decide how to assign students to the school they go to. So many of these districts are choosing to do this based on the neighborhood they live in, or residential assignments. The problem with that? Public schools are funded by local property taxes. So if a kid lives in a poor neighborhood, chances are that kid's gonna go to a school that's underfunded and not very good. In nearly half of the states, affluent districts are getting more local funding than poorer districts. Nationwide, there's a 15% difference between how much states and localities are spending per student in the poorest school districts compared to the richest ones. It may seem like chump change, but it has an impact.
Where you live matters because where you live determines where you go to school. And so if you're living in a neighborhood that is an area of concentrated poverty, for example, or very near to that area of concentrated poverty, then that is the school that you're going to attend.
Today, black students are over 6 times more likely than white students to attend a high poverty school. That means the reality is that poor students of color aren't getting the same kind of quality education as their white middle class peers, the kind of education that Brown v. Board was aiming for. Here's the thing, school integration has been proven to have lasting positive effects on students of color and white students in all kinds of ways. So if we want to stop moving backwards, integration might just be our best bet, because it improves kids' academic performance and their financial future.
If you've ever taken a US history class, you've most likely seen photos like these. Ones that might give the impression that school segregation used to be a big problem, and then we took care of it, and now it's a thing of the past. Today, America's school-age population is more racially diverse than ever before, and that all might lead you to assume that America's classrooms are a whole lot more mixed than they used to be. Progress, right? There's been all these stories in the news that basically say that schools are actually getting more racially segregated.
The most recent data shows the average white student goes to a school that's more than 70% white.
A study ordered by Congress found the percentage of high-poverty schools with mostly black or Hispanic students has more than doubled since 2000.
So what's the real story here? Okay, first, a super quick history lesson. Hang with me. It's been more than 60 years since Brown versus Board of Education, the landmark Supreme Court decision that tossed out the argument that schools could be racially separate but still equal. It was pretty obvious that conditions in black schools were almost always much worse than in white ones. The court made a unanimous decision that black students were being denied a quality education and made school segregation policies illegal. Problem solved, right? Actually, not right away. A lot of white communities in the South fiercely resisted the new rules for years.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
It wasn't until about a decade later, when federal courts literally forced districts to desegregate, that things started to change. Southern schools really started to integrate in the 1970s and 80s because of new programs like cross-district busing that brought a mix of kids from different communities to the same schools. In 1968, more than 3/4 of all black students in the South attended hyper-segregated schools. 20 years later, that rate had dropped to less than 1/4 of all students. There are lots of historical studies showing that this change had an overwhelming positive impact on black student achievement, with pretty much no negative impacts for white students. But not everyone was happy with a more racially integrated school system. A new generation of conservative judges rejected the idea that the federal government should be in the business of forcing local schools to integrate. Districts throughout the South, and some in the North too, began to drop their controversial busing programs, which many community members had rebelled against for years. There were other factors too, including what's called white flight, when a large number of mostly white middle-class communities moved from urban areas to the suburbs. The result? There's been a massive drop in the number of schools that have a balanced mix of students who are white and students who are black and Latino. According to a study by UCLA's Civil Rights Project, the number of hyper-segregated public schools across the country, those with pretty much no white students, has tripled. This resegregation trend has been the most dramatic in the South. But before you northern liberals get too high and mighty, you should know that segregation is actually worse in the North. In fact, the states with the highest rates of school segregation are almost all northern left-leaning ones, like New York, Illinois, Maryland, New Jersey, and yes, even California. So in other words, forced segregation is still against the law. A school can't reject a student just because of the color of his skin. But without being aggressively pushed to integrate, many communities are still self-segregating. Some local activists see this as a natural change. It's not a racial thing, they argue. It's about parents from diverse backgrounds wanting the best for their kids. And that means going to a neighborhood school that they don't have to take a long bus ride to get to, and where they'll be with other kids from their community. It'd be one thing, they say, if a kid was prohibited from attending a school just because of the color of his skin. But those days are long gone. Now, they say, it's about choice, and the government shouldn't be in the business of making kids schlep across town just for the sake of diversity. Diversity advocates argue that what's going on here is a major step backwards in the fight for racial equality. For one, they say, diverse schools have a positive influence on all students, both white and minority. It makes students more comfortable with diversity, reduces prejudice and stereotypes, and better prepares them for success in the real world. And studies have repeatedly shown that segregated schools have a disproportionately negative impact for low-income Black and Latino students. These students are more likely to attend schools where the majority of their classmates are poor, and these schools generally have fewer resources, less experienced teachers, and lower rates of achievement. And all of that can have long-term effects, influencing everything from the chances of graduating from high school and going to college to getting a higher-paying job.
Segregation is when black and white are separate and not together.
Children of color and white children are separated.
There are two different schools, and one is for black people and another one is for white people.
Segregation happens, but it's not like happening as bad as it did before, because before it used to be even worse.
In my class, there's Julia, and she's white, and there's me.
Well, my cousin named Lana, she used to go to a Catholic school. Well, she felt awkward because she was the only black person.
The only other people from the Middle East in the school is my cousins.
Because some people might decide to fit in with the people of the opposite race, but some people might not feel comfortable around people that isn't part of their race.
I've been to a school named PS85, so there were separate classes, English and Spanish, so it wasn't really fair because before I didn't know any English. I only speak Spanish.
I have a sister. She goes to a Catholic school, and her name is Hennessy, and it's a school for rich people, and she had an opportunity to go, but you don't really see a lot of colored people, but there still is, but there's more white people that you see in the school.
One main reason I think that is because of the money too. Private schools tend to be more expensive.
I think that schools are segregated based on where you live, because people of color live with people of color and white people live with other white people.
My mom was looking at a school for me to go to, and the population for whites was really large and the blacks were really small. I think one of the reasons they did that was because number one, they still think whites are better, and number two, because segregation is illegal and they still feel like whites are better, they want mainly white people, but having one or two black people and a couple Latino, it makes them seem like not totally white.
Well, I think diversity is good because we won't only have
people that are from your culture, you have different people. Like, you could talk to different people. You won't be talking to the same people.
This strip in Cape Town, South Africa, divides the beachside community of Strand from the township of Nomzamo. They're only a few meters apart, but the people on each side live very different lives. Strand has backyards and driveways. Nomzamo is much more dense, and the people here have fewer basic services. Less piped water, less internet access, and Nomzamo is majority black, while the area across the line is majority white. If we use dots on a map to represent race, you can see how stark that divide is. If we zoom out to the whole city, we can see it's actually everywhere. And this is the case across much of South Africa. The color of your skin here often determines where you live. It also determines your quality of life. This map shows where jobs and opportunities are primarily concentrated in Cape Town. And this is where most of the city's black people live, in informal settlements called townships on the city's periphery.
People have to move by public transport for up to 3 hours a day, and they can't take care of their obligations in the community with the rest of the family because they're always working and they're always traveling.
For decades, South Africa was under apartheid, a system that wrote segregation into law. A white minority controlled where non-white people could live, work, exist. Many were forced out of their homes. In 1994, a democratically elected government took power and ended apartheid. It was supposed to be a new beginning. But a lot of the country still looks like this. And that's because South Africa's legacy of racial division goes back centuries. In the 1600s, the Dutch took over the southern tip of Africa to supply ships with food along the trade route to Asia. 150 years later, Britain seized it and named it Cape Colony. Many Dutch colonists moved here, further inland, to escape British rule and continue exploiting enslaved people. Just like the Dutch, the British used Cape Colony as a strategic location for trade. It wasn't economically significant. But in the 1870s, that changed when the British started mining diamonds there. Suddenly, Cape Colony was one of Britain's most prized and exploited colonies. In order to get the diamonds out of the country, they built railways to connect the mines up here to the coast. The railways allowed the British to access a global diamond market through the port city of Cape Town. Soon, the economy of Cape Colony was centered around the railroads. especially this main route. The green areas on this map show the Black regions of Cape Colony, largely left out of the railroad economy. Racial inequality in Cape Colony was being reinforced by location. To keep it that way, the colonial government started writing segregation into law. The Native Lands Act of 1913 pushed Black people into these areas, only 8% of South Africa's land, and restricted them from owning land everywhere else. Or relocated them to the edges of the major cities to work for white people. These laws began to shape the region. Cape Town's growth from the increased trade turned the port town into a major city. Many migrants from the rest of the colony and elsewhere moved here, to what was then the outskirts of Cape Town, where former enslaved people, merchants, artists, and immigrants were forming a neighborhood called District 6. As the city grew around District 6, so did the neighborhood. For decades, District 6 was a thriving, integrated community.
We were a very cosmopolitan, you could say, family almost, because there were people from all different nationalities, from all different walks of life.
This was the statement, your child is my child.
But it wouldn't last. In 1934, Britain's legal hold in what was now the Union of South Africa officially ended. The remaining white minority, the descendants of Dutch colonists, took control, and they built on the foundation the British were leaving behind. Between 1949 and 1971, the all-white government passed 148 laws solidifying apartheid.
Apartheid allowed for the full realization of the ambition of the fascist project in South Africa.
In 1950, the Population Registration Act officially classified people by race: white, colored, and native or black, and eventually Asian. Then they made laws saying where people could live. Around the country, Black South Africans were moved into these areas, called homelands or Bantustans. Bantustans were rural areas and had underdeveloped economies. Many of them were in the areas Britain had already excluded from the railway economy, and where Black land ownership had been restricted too. Black people were forced to carry passbooks that specified where they were allowed to work or travel to. In cities like Cape Town, the Group Areas Act moved the remaining non-whites into separate urban areas.
The most prime land and the land closest to high-valued property was allocated to white people.
In 1966, the government declared that District 6 was now a whites-only area. The residents of District 6 received removal letters like this one that said living there was illegal because they were not white. Bulldozers drove into District 6 and razed it to the ground.
We lived here. We had a life here.
It was very traumatic for a lot of people.
It's like ripping out someone's heart.
More than 60,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes. This kind of violence against non-white people was commonplace around the country. But after decades of pressure, both from within South Africa and abroad, apartheid rule finally came to an end. The new government lifted restrictions on where people could live. Millions of people who had been excluded from economic development for centuries migrated to major cities looking for basic services and economic opportunity.
For any family with no prospect of employment, the most rational, logical choice to make is to migrate to an urban center.
They settled where there was empty land, creating townships on the peripheries of major cities, like Cape Town. The government built millions of homes and expanded clean water and electricity.
But it had a number of unforeseen consequences, the most important of which is that the only land that could be used for the public housing program was on the periphery of the city. And for that reason, a brilliant intention to overcome the apartheid legacy unintentionally reproduced the very same legacy it was trying to undo.
Today, 60% of the mostly Black population of Cape Town lives in these townships at the edge of the city. The thing is, Cape Town city center has land to develop. But because of its location, it's valuable. So it usually gets sold to private developers who build luxury apartments. Nearly $1 billion worth of them are going up by the coast. But right in the heart of Cape Town, by all the expensive developments, District 6 remains largely untouched. The former residents have fought against private development, and they've actually succeeded. Some have even managed to return to houses built by the city.
I wanted to come back here where I was born, which was part of our family's heritage.
I couldn't believe that I was back. It was a sense of relief.
But there are still hundreds of claimants waiting to get back to District 6.
We haven't done the difficult and the painful work to confront what the intergenerational consequences are of colonialism, of apartheid.
The story of Cape Town and South Africa's racial segregation starts far in the past, but it's very much entangled with the present. Apartheid and colonialism here are over, but many of the barriers they built have yet to be dismantled.
The kind of psychic scars that's left on individuals and on communities, we haven't begun the work of saying, how do we live together, right? In the face of that history.